Welcome to this afternoon's program. My name is Kyle Hubbard, and I am a member of the philosophy department here at St. Anselm, where I teach courses in ethics and business ethics. So again, welcome to this afternoon's program, The Care and Presence of Leaders in a Crisis. And I'd also like to welcome our speaker, Professor Joanne Ciulla. Today's event is the latest installment in the Ethics and Governance Speaker Series. Funding for the Ethics and Governance programs comes from a $2 million endowment created by the New Hampshire Secretary of State's office and the Center for Public Responsibility and Corporate Citizenship, awarded to St. Anselm College in 2013. The endowment was created from a settlement reached between the New Hampshire Securities Bureau and Tyco International Limited in 2002 and is administered by the University of New Hampshire Foundation. The Ethics and Governance Forum features programs on topics related to governance, leadership, social responsibility, and the common good. The leaders of our corporations and institutions have a profound effect on whether or not the common good is promoted. So I'm particularly pleased to welcome Professor Ciulla, one of the leading voices in the field of leadership ethics, today to address the vital role of leaders in times of crisis. Professor Ciulla is Professor of Leadership Ethics and Director of the Institute for Ethical Leadership at Rutgers Business School. Prior to joining Rutgers, she held the Costin Family Chair in Leadership and Ethics at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond. Professor Ciulla has authored and edited numerous books and articles in the fields of leadership studies and business ethics. She has held appointments at Wharton, Harvard, and visiting appointments at universities on at least 5 continents, at least by my count, and has received many prestigious awards, including the Legacy Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Leadership Association. And just on a personal level, I and my students in business ethics have greatly benefited from Professor Ciulla's editing of Honest Work, a business ethics reader that I use in my course every semester, as well as her writings in that volume on work, leadership, and leisure. Before I turn it over to our speaker, let me give you some instructions about the question and answer period. You may submit questions at any point during or after the presentation by typing them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We will be selecting questions for Professor Ciulla to answer from the questions that come in. We will try to ask as many of them as possible, but there are many audience members on this call, so we may not be able to ask all of them. So now that the housekeeping is out of the way, join me in welcoming Professor Joanne Ciulla. Professor Ciulla.
Yeah, it would probably be good if I unmuted myself. I should know how to do this after teaching online so much, but what I was saying is it's a real pleasure to meet you all, and even if it's only virtually. And I want to thank the folks in New Hampshire for inviting me to give this lecture. So let's hope that I do this properly. I'm going to share my screen with you so we can look at a few slides, and then I'll get into my lecture. Okay. Here we go. I hope everyone can see this. So I'm going to talk about the presence of leaders in a crisis and the notion of care. Care is a very important phenomenon in leadership. And, you know, if you think about it, care might be one of the fundamental jobs of leaders. Their job is, in a sense, to care for an organization or group of people. It's to look after them. But what does care mean, and what does presence have to do with it? Well, presence can be interpreted in all sorts of ways. We can think of presence as one's presence, which is not just a physical notion of presence, but also more of a psychological notion of presence, a personality notion of presence. You can say someone has a good presence. I'm actually talking about care in terms of that notion of presence and just physical presence. In other words, I'm going to talk about being there. My opening slide has a picture of the Roman Forum, the ruins of Rome, because we're going to be going at this subject in a peculiar way. One of the things about my research is I really enjoy looking at leadership, not as something that's just happening now or some study or piece of research that's been done, but really as a part of the entire human condition. Because one of the things I found from studying leadership and actually from studying ethics is since people haven't really changed much, yes, the worlds around us have changed, but people themselves haven't changed much. And that's why it sometimes benefits us to go back and look at other parts of history and leadership and ethics in those parts of history, because in a way, history gives us a place to stand and look at where we are and what we are today. So I want to talk about presence in terms of being there. But first, we'll look at being there in terms of an old movie and a wonderful old novel. This movie, I recommend it to you because it's a very peculiar movie. It stars Peter Sellers, and it's called Being There. And in some ways, the movie is about what I want to talk about. In the movie, Peter Sellers is a very childlike and probably mentally limited man who works as a gardener for a wealthy man. The wealthy man suddenly dies, and Sellers, who plays the role of a man named Chance, finds himself in a peculiar situation because he's actually never ventured out of his master's property. Well, he ventures out, gets hit by a car, which is owned by a wealthy Washingtonian politician, and the politician brings him home with him. And the character in the play doesn't say very much, in the movie doesn't say very much, but what he says has to do either with TV shows or gardening. Well, among all these power holders in Washington, his few comments seem strikingly profound. And as the book goes on, he becomes a kind of companion to the people he's living with, and simply his presence, or by being there, he helps to soothe the death of one of the spouses and becomes a significant figure. Sometimes merely being there is a comfort to others, and sometimes merely being there shows you care. And that's the theme that we want to look at. So I want to first go to care. If we go back to the myth of Cura, and this is the myth of Cura is told by someone named Hyginus, and Cura is the root of the word for care. And the myth of Cura is a very simple one. Heidegger talks about it in his work. The myth is that Cura was walking along and she found some mud and she molded an image of a human. And she wanted to name it. And so she ran into Jupiter and said, "Oh, I just made this thing. What should I name it?" And Jupiter said, "Well, I should name it." And she said, "No, I want to name it." And eventually they appealed to Zeus to say, who would get to name this person? And Zeus said, well, Cura, since Cura made it, she can name the human, and in a way she will, because she looked after it, because she cared for it, she gets that honor. So he says, and here I have a quote from Xenophon, "Nor was the deity content to care for man's body. What is of yet higher moment, he has implanted in him the noblest type of soul." So the notion of care isn't just caring for the body, it's caring for the whole person. Cura, also, we get the word cure, which means to heal. In times of crisis, part of the job of leaders is not literally to heal people, but to be a part of the cure, because it's not just getting them through the crisis, but it's helping them to endure the pains of the crisis itself. So how am I going to talk about this? Well, I'm going to use a central story that has become a part of the way we talk about leaders in times of crisis. And that is, we often use the expression, "She fiddled while Rome burned," to talk about a politician who's not paying attention to her job. But I got fascinated by this expression because it's an expression that dates back to a very old story, a historical account about the Emperor Nero, who you see in this picture. Now, first of all, we know Nero didn't fiddle while Rome burned because fiddles hadn't been invented. The picture is much more accurate because Nero probably played a sitar, which is a lute-like instrument, not a fiddle. But I'll get to fiddling in a minute. So let's talk about Nero. So Nero was the emperor of Rome. He comes from a not very pleasant lineage. Caligula was one of his relatives. And Nero had a very bad reputation. He allegedly kicked his pregnant wife to death because she complained to him when he came home late from the races. Not a very good guy. He also, one of the first things he did when he was made emperor was to kill his mother. So this is not a guy with a great reputation. There are all sorts of bad things said about Nero. Anyway, in 64 AD, there was a huge fire in Rome, and Nero was down at his vacation house, which was down the coast. They came and told him there was a fire, and he kind of went, eh. And they said, yeah, but it might burn your palace. And so he got on his boat, he came back to Rome. And then according to the accounts, he did what leaders did. So I want to read you the ancient accounts of what Nero did. Here we have this public official basically coming to the scene of a crisis. According to the historian Tacitus writes, Nero finally arrived in Rome, and he said, as a relief for the evicted and fugitive people, he opened up the plain of Mars and the monuments of Agrippa. In fact, he even opened up his own gardens and set up improvised buildings to receive the destitute. And he had comestibles sailed up from the Ostia and nearby municipalities. And the price of grain was reduced to keep from price gouging. All of which, though popular, proved unavailing because a rumor spread, this is a rumor, that at the very time of the city's blaze, Nero had actually mounted his domestic stage and sung a song about the sack of Troy, assimilating the present calamities into olden disasters. Okay, so figure this out. Your city's on fire. I mean, you could be in California. You've got huge fires raging. And what does the mayor of your city do? Well, he goes to the site of the fire, or he goes to the mayor's mansion, wherever that is, and writes a song about it. I mean, it's an insane story. People love this story. Historians wrote about it, not only Tacitus, but Suetonius, Cassius Dio, a number of Roman historians wrote about this. It's a great story. But it's a powerful story because the story itself tells us about what we expect from leaders in times of crisis. And it also tells us about the fact that where a leader is physically present during a crisis is highly significant to people. So we want to talk about that significance. The other thing about the story, other historians, for example, Suetonius, when he tells the story, actually blames the fire on Nero and says that Nero set it so that he could do some urban renewal because he didn't like the city of Rome. Other people said that he was there to take the valuables away from rich people's houses because he wouldn't let them go back to their houses. Now, obviously, this might be a safety precaution, but the fact that there are these rumors and stories about Nero tells you that people's perception of Nero as a leader was that he didn't care about them, even though, as we see, there's evidence that he did all the things that a caring leader might do. So how do we get this story? Why do we use this expression? I mean, not everybody in the world is a scholar of Roman history, right? Well, it comes down to us through good old William Shakespeare. And Shakespeare was the first to use this expression he used it in two plays. One was The Taming of the Shrew. And he says, like Nero, who fiddled while Rome burned. And he's talking about a leader who is feckless and not paying attention to something. It then shows up in Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, which is a very influential dictionary. And there, have you ever noticed that the word well, first of all, Shakespeare used fiddle. Fide means stringed instrument. Shakespeare used the word fiddle, not really paying attention to the fact there weren't any fiddles. But in Samuel Johnson's dictionary, what's interesting is the word fiddle comes to mean a careless or feckless act by someone. So when someone fiddles around, they're doing something trivial. So it comes down to us in language, and we begin to use it in all sorts of images. And so when we go from Nero, who allegedly was fiddling around while Rome burned, we see it elsewhere. I don't know if you can see it that well. I guess if you're looking on a computer, you might. Down here is a depiction of George Bush, President George Bush, and he has a guitar. And this image appeared in a publication online after Hurricane Katrina. Many people thought that Bush was at the wrong place when Katrina hit. So let's look at this. On the day that Katrina made landfall, he was with a country singer named Mark Willis, and he was at a fundraiser in California. And he was photographed playing a guitar. You'll notice the guitar has a presidential seal on it. Now, it's kind of an interesting story because we're saying here he's doing something trivial when this big thing happens. So where do people expect their leaders to be when there's a crisis? Well, they can't always be on the site of the crisis, but they at least expect leaders to be in their offices. And what does the physical presence means? It means that they are attending to the crisis. They are with people. And the idea of leaders being on vacation or at a fundraiser or doing something trivial when other people are suffering in a crisis is something that has resonated throughout history. And here, of course, they literally talk about the New Orleans Convention Center, if you remember back to that. And here is the president photoshopped in playing the guitar. So this powerful, powerful image says that presence really matters in a time of crisis. And again, here I'm talking literally about where you are and how it signifies a notion of care. I mean, at its most basic level, showing care does involve showing up. I mean, imagine that you have a baby and the baby is crying in another room. Parents, when their baby's crying in the other room, and don't just sort of yell from the living room, there, everything's fine, you'll be okay. No, I mean, part of what you have to do as a caring parent usually is you go in and you pick up the baby and hold them. Metaphorically, that's what people want when they're in distress. They want some sense of physical action that shows that leaders care. And this is very complicated because obviously leaders can't run from crisis to crisis, but certainly we see it on the news every day that leaders show up in front of fires or floods or whatever, that the mayor or the governor or sometimes even the president is kind of expected to be there because it tells people that they care. Now, it's sort of interesting because there was a lot of flack about where President Bush was after 9/11. And that was interesting because if you remember during the crisis, there was a problem because the president was flying around in an airplane, and that was a security precaution. But people were saying he should have gone back to the White House. As a matter of fact, his own father said that he should have gone right back to the White House. Again, this notion that leaders are supposed to be in a certain place at a time like this. Whereas after 9/11, you see Bush in a place where he ought to be, on the site of it, with the people he ought to be with, which are certainly some of the people, the first responders in the case. So here you get both an example of a leader not being in the right place and then putting themselves in the right place in the second part of the act. Leaders kind of learn where they should be. Sometimes they can't be in the right place. Sometimes they're not in the right place by accident. And then, of course, I think through experience, they begin to learn where they have to be in times of crisis. Now, not to be bipartisan in this in these highly divided days, we can see here's a nice picture of President Obama fiddling while Congress burns. This was during the time when they were trying to pass the healthcare law, and some people thought that the president wasn't paying enough attention to all of the maneuverings going on to pass this law. So we have a picture of him that appears fiddling. And again, I didn't make up these pictures. These are pictures that showed up in the media. But I want to give you another example of this that is also quite powerful and shows that this is not just an American phenomena. And I think when you study leadership and ethics in leadership, you really need to test a lot of your ideas, not just in your own culture, but in other cultures. Many years ago, it was actually in 2000 that a submarine named the Kursk, a Russian submarine, sank and there was a huge amount of flack because when it sank, President Putin, who was of course still president, President Putin did not go to the site of the disaster. And what was fascinating about this is there was international outrage at the fact that he stayed at his vacation home instead of going to the disaster. And I want to read you just a couple interesting things. The press in Russia was a lot freer back then. But there were several things that were written in the Russian press about this. A Moscow daily declared that it was particularly irksome that Putin has not interrupted his vacation, if only for an hour, to support the seamen in distress. And then another reporter from another journalist in Russia wrote, "How come in the past 5 days, Putin, who once spent a night aboard a submarine and knows what being underwater means, has not found the time to address the families of the Kursk seamen? Why does he think he can remain silent these days when all of Russia's heart is going out to the people aboard this submarine?" There were also comments from British newspapers, Norwegian newspapers about the fact that Putin just didn't leave his vacation house. Now, Putin replied in a very pragmatic way to this in an interview with Voice of America. He said, "The only thing that would have changed my conduct as head of state, would it be possible for me to suspend my working meetings, to suspend them at the place of my vacation home in Sochi and go to the Black Sea? I could have also gone to the capital of Moscow." But he said that would be just a PR activity, since any city or country all over the world, I am always linked to the military, I have communication means, and I can discuss any problems at the table. A perfectly practical answer, but it doesn't solve the issue of how a leader demonstrates care. Now, what's interesting about this, and it's parallel to the Bush case, is Putin and his did know that he needed to go to Chechnya when there was Chechen rebels raided a school and killed a number of school children. He was up there right away, and this happened after the Kursk. And he was meeting with families. He went to hospitals. He did all of the things that people expect their leaders to do. So leaders learn this, and it becomes a very important symbolic gesture and a gesture that shows care. Here is President Trump. He went to Puerto Rico after the hurricane there. And again, being there is significant, and I think that had a significance that he went to the location to show some care. I'm not sure about throwing paper towels. I leave that all up to you. But again, this notion, you have to be there, they have to show up. After that, though, there were online, we'll see, here's the picture on the left is supposed to be Bush fiddling. I mean, not Bush, our president, current president, fiddling, and Trump also looking like Nero with his phone, tweeting, I guess. So this image carries through. It doesn't matter if it's Democrats or Republicans, but it's an image and a phrase that symbolizes not caring based on presence. And presence and care. Care also means when I say I care for this or I take care of this, it means attentiveness. It also happens in the business world. This is BP CEO Tony Hayward. Now here, he's in a slightly different role, but what's interesting about it is he got a lot of flack because he was photographed by a British newspaper going yachting on his rather extravagant yacht when the oil slick that had occurred in the Gulf had kept fishermen from getting on their boats and going out and catching things at sea. So we can see in this case that leaders at all levels need to think about where they are, what they're doing in times of crisis. So the interesting thing about this is, here we have a picture of Princess Di and the Queen of England. And the difference is that leaders have to have a duty to care for people. As I said in the beginning, that's part of leadership. But what's even more powerful is when people sense that they actually feel care, because care is something that you feel and something you have a duty to do. So I care for him is about well, it could mean two things. It can mean I have feelings for him, or it can mean I literally take care of him. And the idea that you have a duty for care is that I have to care for someone, or I need to care for someone, or it's my responsibility to care for someone. And it's interesting to look at Princess Di and the Queen, because I think the Queen is known and respected for her carrying out her duties in her role as the Queen. And she goes to hospitals and does all of those kinds of presence things that show she cares. What people really liked about Princess Di is she has all of the kinds of duties that people at that time had in the royal family, but people felt like she felt care as well as having a duty to care. And so this raises the question that I find interesting in leadership, and that is, do leaders have to have tender hearts? Do they have to feel care, or is it mainly important for them to live up to a duty to care? Duties to care you can learn, and you can also learn when you're supposed to show up. And as we've seen, sometimes it's going to be by trial and error. But having that sense, some leaders have it and some don't. I would argue that what's most important in leadership is the duty to care. For example, presidents are supposed to meet with families of fallen soldiers. That's an important duty of a presidency when there are, when we have troops in areas of war. And the interesting thing about that is they may not want to do it, or they may not feel like they should be doing it, or feel like the kinds of emotions or empathy. But by carrying out their duty to care, actually meeting with them, they probably are better able to cultivate feelings of care. So showing up at disasters, even though sometimes it's inconvenient and difficult, showing up at disasters is important because it contributes to the development of feelings of care. If a leader doesn't have them, if they do have them, it may heighten those feelings of care. Proximity, psychologists have written a lot about proximity. Proximity is extremely powerful. So you can develop feelings of care by carrying out your duties to care. So when we get to the issue today, leaders are in the middle of a huge crisis. So what is leadership like in the age of COVID? Well, there are some lessons that we have to learn here and that all leaders ought to keep in mind. First of all, it's going to depend on what kind of leader they are. Where they are is really important in the time of COVID. So, you think about the spikes in cases that we're experiencing now in some parts of the country and the world, and we're experiencing earlier in the pandemic. Who the leaders are is important because that helps to define what their role is and where they need to be physically. And of course, in this crisis, it's especially difficult because of the fact that leaders can get this. And we've seen many leaders have gotten COVID because they've been in proximity of people with COVID. And they've probably been in that proximity because that's part of their duty to be there. And then what they are doing, obviously, in a time of crisis like this, if leaders seem to be playing a lot of golf or not paying attention to briefings on the state of their city, their state, their community, that's going to be a problem, and it does send messages to their constituencies. Then obviously what they say about it and how they respond to their own failures, because part of caring is that nobody is perfect and leaders certainly aren't perfect. So in trying to care for people, if they do it the wrong way, and certainly many state, local, national leaders have made mistakes in this crisis, but what's really important is how they respond to it, because caring is also not just about doing things to help people or helping to cure people or helping to get people through a crisis. But care is also about caring about how they do their job. And of course, correcting mistakes, admitting mistakes, and moving forward from mistakes shows that they really care about their job and they care about their constituents. So we've gone, taken a very short journey from ancient Rome to the present. But as you look at the news, think about where leaders are and think about when they get in trouble because they're in the wrong place or they're looking like they're doing the wrong thing. This is true not only in our country, but in other countries. There's slight cultural variations, but the temptation in a day when we have so many great communication systems is to phone it in or to Zoom it in or to be on television or make recorded remarks. That can work, but it only takes you so far. Those recorded remarks are best made from your office. They're best made showing or signaling that you're on the job, and most importantly, that you're paying attention to the plight and the crisis of those you serve. So with that, I want to leave you with one quote, and this is from Seneca. Now, there's an irony in quoting Seneca, but I'll read the quote first. Humans are given reason so they can achieve the good. But they were given the capacity to care so they can perfect the good. Now, the reason why Seneca is significant, who was Seneca among other, besides being a philosopher, he was Nero's tutor, which just goes to show you can teach students, but they don't always learn. So with that, I want to thank you, and I'll be most happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Joanne, for that enlightening talk on leadership and the duty to care. So there's a number of questions that have come in. Why don't we start with this one? So if you were advising a leader in a time of crisis, what are the top, say, 3 to 5 things you would tell them to do?
In regard to this crisis or just any crisis?
The question is any crisis.
In any crisis, okay. A couple of things. First of all, you would call in your most trusted advisor. It's foolish to think that leaders should be making decisions all by themselves. That's number one. And especially if you can get a variety of perspectives, because that's going to be very important. And we learned this from the famous case of Kennedy. So that would be the first thing. The second thing, obviously, is to get all the information you need. The third thing is to figure out what people need. That's most important. What they need, not just from you, but what they need all around them. So the first part of a crisis is getting advice, and it's the collecting information and collecting sort of what people need, and then of course assigning those things to other people. Who's going to take care of the needs of these people. That has to get done really fast. Then you're ready to start talking a little bit to the public and to making a statement and deciding whether or not you can actually get to where you have to go. You shouldn't wait too long for that, though, because people, I mean, for those of you who remember back to 9/11, one of the strangest things about 9/11 was that no major public official appeared on any news program until Rudolph Giuliani showed up. And it was kind of interesting because after that, he became a hero. He's a great example of being there because he actually was there. And so people look for authorities to talk to them. And it took a really long time, but all of the senators and Congress people got pulled away. I think there were a few who managed to talk to the press. But for a while, actually, the major authorities that people looked to were news anchors on the various news programs. But what they were needing were major authorities. So getting back to the question, though, so then you have to figure out where you want to be. And either you can't necessarily go right away because it depends on the crisis, but you can get out the message that here's what I've done, because people need to know you're paying attention and you're doing something for them, because that in and of itself is going to be comforting. And then with that, figure out if you're going to go there, figure out if you're not going to go there. If it's impossible to go there, say, I will be at my office and all of the relevant staff will be here and we will be working on this and I will be reporting back to you. One model we got on that with the COVID crisis was certainly Governor Cuomo of New York. And he did a great job of keeping people informed, and a mixture of information and kind of the right feelings of care he conveyed, and a little bit of humor to sort of try to make people feel better without misrepresenting the severity of the crisis.
Your response to that question, especially mentioning Governor Cuomo and Mayor Giuliani at the time, got me thinking, to what extent is just being fortunate, just being lucky, part of being a good leader, right? They were at the right place, in the sense that they were where the crisis was at its worst.
Well, I mean, in Giuliani's case, if we go, back to then, he had managed this kind of crisis before because there have been terrorist attacks in New York. So he also had some experience. But yeah, part of it is a kind of moral luck, we can say. But and then it's also whether, look at it from the other side, Kyle, and that is, it might be the moral luck of the people of the state of New York that you had one governor as opposed to another governor. So some leaders, and we're seeing this all over, meet crises well. They seem to be the right person for the right time. Angela Merkel in Germany is a really great example too. She's handled this well. The Prime Minister of New Zealand is another, that they just seem to be the right sorts of leaders at the right time. Because a whole lot about leadership isn't, most people think leadership's about traits and leaders have to have certain traits, but it's also about context and having the right person at the right time. So, some people are lucky to have the leaders they have during a crisis, and some are very unlucky to have them. And so, yeah, luck works both ways.
Yeah, so there's, relating to what you just said about the right leader for the right time, there's a few questions here actually about how leaders can be developed.
Mm-hmm.
So, how are leaders developed? I mean, is someone born a leader? Is somebody learns by the school of hard knocks through doing it wrong, like you suggested with Putin or someone like that?
The School of Hard Knocks is very expensive. I mean, college is expensive these days, but Hard Knocks for leaders is really expensive. Well, as you know, I was one of the faculty who helped design the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and we thought long and hard about that question. And I think the beginning point of that is that there's three areas that are important. First thing in developing leaders is developing perspective. Leaders have to take a big picture view of things. I think that's one of the big things that separates them, the concept of leadership from the concept of management. One writer wrote, leadership is the art of sensing the whole, and that they have to look at the big picture and how all the parts interface. But moreover, leaders have to have perspective of where they are and what they're doing in the context of much broader things. And I think liberal arts education is probably the best way to develop perspective on things. Obviously, problem solving and critical thinking skills are fundamental. Leaders get advice from all sorts of experts, but being able to critically analyze what experts are saying is extremely important. And so those kinds of critical thinking skills are very important. And notice the first two are things that you can't do in a management training program. And so I like to think, you know, when we started the Jepson School, people said, why are you teaching leadership to undergraduates? Shouldn't you be teaching it to, you know, mid-level managers and stuff? And it's no, I mean, because it really encompasses the way you see the world. And so that perspective. And then the third part that we get certainly from the study of the humanities is understanding people. And that includes understanding yourself. And certainly literature and psychology and courses like that in the humanities and in the social sciences, sociology, help us to understand things about people. So those are the big three things that you need to prepare people for leadership. And the rest of it, you know, from the little skills like public speaking and things like that, that you can be trained to do. And there are wonderful programs that show people how to do that. But I think everyone needs that solid basis to really be good as a leader. It's not training. It's not just training. You need a base to train those skills upon.
Well, we at St. Anselm appreciate the answer that talked about a liberal arts education. So.
Oh yeah, well, I'm a big liberal arts person, even though I'm in a business school.
So tying into what your answer to that last question about developing good leaders, to what extent do good leaders need to be good persons? Right? I mean, you gave examples of leaders that some of us might have strong feelings about one way or the other about whether they're people or not. Do good leaders need to be good people? Do they need other virtues besides the virtues of care or other virtues of leadership?
I think they're pretty inseparable to be good people and to be good leaders. I think there are things, you know, so when I was talking about feeling care, you could be a kind of person who's kind of rough around the edges and doesn't have a lot of empathy for other people. But I think there are ways empathy can be developed in leaders. So that was the point I was trying to make about just showing up can help to develop empathy in people. But unless you're a really good actor, it's pretty hard. People are smart and they can tell who's real and who's not real. Now, this is not to say leading requires a certain amount of acting. I mean, just being yourself, obviously in the role of a leader, you have to play that role, whatever it looks like. But you can't play it completely divorced from what you are as a person, because then you will come off as a phony. And people are pretty smart. And even though a lot of people in leadership roles think they can fool everybody, they'll figure it out. So yeah, I think fundamentally, it would be very odd for somebody to be a great leader who wasn't a great person. It eventually I mean, I have lots of cases where it eventually catches up with you as a leader.
So when we're in person, we always prioritize questions from students. So I'm going to ask
Okay, excellent.
business ethics students this semester.
Ah.
he writes, leaders are finite beings, just like us, so they can only convey so much care. So to what standard or mean must we hold our leaders when it comes to showing care?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question for the reason that I totally agree that, and actually Plato even says this in the beginning of the Statesman. He says leaders are not like shepherds to their flock, because shepherds are human and sheep are sheep, which is his very simple statement of that. Yes, we can. The issue of standards, I believe everybody should be held to the same moral standards. So I think that's right. But in the case of leaders, the standards in terms of their behavior is different, for the simple reason that consequences of their actions are greater. That's why in one of my books, I say leadership is morality and immorality magnified. So whatever they do either harms or benefits more people. And because of that, they have to be able to live up to those standards. So in terms of where they should be during a crisis, they need to understand that in that role, what they do has a much bigger impact than being in other roles. And so that, in that respect, it's not necessarily higher or lower, but it's a different standard because of the role.
So this question, actually, there are a couple questions here about leading in this pandemic.
Right.
So what is particularly required in the pandemic? And I'm thinking about issues. I mean, you mentioned this, but right, you can't be there in the same way. So there's a couple questions about, does being online count as being there, right? With a family member over Zoom, right? Family member of a fallen serviceman or woman. Is that sufficient in this crisis? How much does the public need to see people there? And they're there even in this time.
Yeah, and of course, this time the pandemic does qualify it in the sense that being there can be dangerous, and it is interesting that so many public officials have become ill. So yeah, I mean, here's where it gets interesting. So being there is often denigrated to public relations. It's just PR. So let's say you were a mayor and your city was in the middle of a pandemic and you went to visit someone in the IC who is seriously ill with COVID. Well, I mean, that's a pretty dangerous thing to do. I mean, maybe you could suit up and try to be as safe as possible. Is that the standard? Well, I think that's probably not the standard, but I could see in that context that, let's say you were the mayor and you contacted a number of families who lost people because of COVID in your city, and it was covered by the press. Well, I know everybody's gotten cynical about all this, but I would say that's probably not a bad thing, because it says, look, I can't go see these people, but I want to express the fact that I see what's happening. I see you. And this notion of I see you, yes, can be conveyed online with these extenuating circumstances. If there was no pandemic, we could talk about seeing families who had losses in the fires in California. Now that's a little bit different if it's possible for the governor, the mayor, or somebody to see them. If that was a gesture that allowed people to say, okay, he's seeing me, then that's important, because that's what people need. I mean, in a way, and Freud's written about this and other people, leadership's a little like, in crises, is a little like the parent with a crying baby. I mean, that's not to denigrate followers, but to say there's a need for some kind of presence. And so we have to qualify that need given the circumstances of COVID.
So following up on that about being there and the importance of being there, one insightful question here. So this person writes, being there is certainly critical for major crises. At what point does being there become a trap for a leader when what some consider to be a crisis is not easily identified, Or in fact, is something a leader doesn't want to get elevated into a larger crisis than the problem merits?
Right. I think that's the tricky part. And that's why it's such an interesting question in terms of looking at cases. Because you have to begin to, as a leader, you have to begin to develop your sense of how to make those important distinctions. Because it's a slippery slope. If I show up for this sort of minor crisis, and then people expect me to show up for all crises. And that's tricky. I remember going back to President Bush. I forgot what it was. There was some event and people thought he should go to it. And he said, well, if I go, it'll just cause traffic jams. And he went on this whole kind of thing. And it was kind of interesting because, what he was saying was absolutely true. But at the same time, he was also, you could see, and I tended to agree that he didn't need to go to it, that he was sort of saying, well, is this big enough for me? So again, it's going to be a judgment call. I don't think there's hard and fast rules, but we can learn a lot from the good things and the right calls and the wrong calls of leaders. That's where studying leadership can be useful.
So how about the application of this notion and of the duty to care and the feelings of care? How does this apply in the business environment? Mm-hmm. So, right, our series, we bring in people to talk about sometimes ethical issues in government and that kind of, but also in the business world. So what does a business leader need to do? What does care look like for a business leader?
Well, I mean, there are some things that are quite similar and others that aren't. I mean, so the example I gave about Tony Hayden, VP, is a good one because when they're in a crisis, first of all, senior business people really need to pay attention to what they're doing and what they're photographed doing and what the press does, because they need to model all hands on, everyone pay attention. And that's a tricky part. The other thing is that it doesn't even have to be senior people. So say people at more lower level management levels, there will be crises that go on in their smaller world that may require them to come home from the vacation or to go and see an employee in the hospital, but then they have to make all those judgment calls because, if you sort of take a Kantian view of it and say, well, if I go in this case, can I make a rule that I go in cases where X, Y, and Z occurs? Can you apply that kind of reasoning to it? And I think that's something that intuitively most managers know. They don't want to do one thing for one person and not for another. So they have to kind of figure that out. So it applies pretty much the same in the business world. And lastly, during COVID, one of the interesting things that I've heard about is that a lot of business leaders, say, oh, well, we're running our business fine. All our employees are working from home, totally oblivious to the fact that some people live in very small places and have small children running around that have to be homeschooled and are learning online and driving their parents nuts. This even happens at universities. And they're under huge amounts of stress. Meanwhile, the senior executives are out in the Hamptons at their beautiful palatial vacation house, which is, 4,000 square feet, and they don't have any of those problems. So, sometimes senior people in large corporations kind of forget what the ordinary person is like, and they lose empathy for their situation. So I think in times of crisis, sort of making sure you understand what people are going through in your organization or even in the group that you manage is really important. And then figuring out, what kinds of ways can I be present? And it might be just like us on Zoom.
And even while this is present in people's circumstances in a different way, some positive examples I've heard from business leaders and also nonprofit leaders is taking voluntary pay cuts during this COVID time because they know they've had to do it for their, some of the lower level folks in places have either been laid off or have lost income. So even that gesture of a 10, 20% pay cut, well, okay, it doesn't mean as much for the CEO. Still goes a ways towards expressing care.
Yep. And it says we're in this together. And one of the things, one of the worst things you can do as a leader is to act as if you're separate from everyone else. You're special. We treat leaders like they're special, but they shouldn't think they're special.
Yeah. So I think we've got time for one more question here.
Okay.
Actually, how about this? We could, since we're in a college environment, what do you think is the role, or what have you seen as the role of college presidents and college leadership during this time? What does that look like?
Well, we know some college presidents, like the president of Notre Dame, got himself in some trouble by getting COVID by not wearing a mask after he had to shut down his own university. So college presidents have a really important role to play, first of all, to support all of their constituencies in this and communicate with them about it on a somewhat regular basis, report on what's going on, how they're thinking about things. I think all people have been getting messages at universities that basically we don't know, where it's a wait and see for a lot of this. But, and college presidents of ours took a pay cut for it. But, again, I mean, I've noticed in universities, they often forget that people have children at home and that teaching at home becomes really difficult when you've got kids running around, small children. So I think their roles are pretty much analogous to it. Most importantly, though, I think college presidents have in some ways less control over students. And the hardest part is getting students to behave responsibly without being overbearing. And I think that's where a lot of universities that opened up failed. They were very good in the classroom, but they weren't able to do that. So college presidents have to have a very, very difficult job. They definitely herd cats when it comes to students, and certainly when it comes to faculty. But I think that they're all learning as they go along, because this is a pretty unprecedented situation, and I think we have to have cut a little slack to both college presidents and others who don't. But of course, the foolish ways they would act might be continuing to keep their salaries, or when they've cut off travel budgets to everyone else, continuing to travel and things like that. That kind of behavior needs special justification in order for it to look like they really believe we're in it together.
Well, thank you very much. It is time to wrap up. I know if we were not in this environment, you would all give Professor Ciulla a round of applause. So just thank you for your enlightening talk, and thanks to all of you for the discussion and the thoughtful questions and comments. So the Center for Ethics at St. Anselm will be hosting more online events in the future. So please pay attention to your email and to our website for upcoming events. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.